All right, so for today's vodcast, we'll be looking at one of the most important turning points in human history. This turning point is called the Neolithic Revolution. Within this vodcast, we have a few different learning objectives, lesson objectives. The first is to define these two terms, Paleolithic and Neolithic. We'll be able to do that shortly. Our next objective is to define this term called Nomads and describe who these people were and what their way of life was all about. So we'll be able to do that shortly. You'll be able to explain the Neolithic Revolution. Right, so you'll understand what the term Neolithic means, but then there's this thing called the Neolithic Revolution, which is really important for you guys to understand this year. And then lastly, we're going to describe the effects of the Neolithic Revolution on humans throughout the world. So how did it change? How did it force people to live differently after this revolution occurred? All right, so we'll be looking at that soon. So first of all, we're going to look at what Paleolithic and Neolithic is, and this is pretty easy, right? Paleolithic, paleo meaning old, and lithic meaning stones or rocks. We have the Old Stone Age, or the Old Stone Period, the Paleolithic period. This period of time lasted from about 2 million BC to about 10,000 BC. So almost 2 million years of human history is made up of this period of time called the Old Stone Age, right? So Paleolithic, old stones, the Old Stone Age. We then have the New Stone Age, or the Neolithic period. Neo meaning new, lithic, like with Paleolithic meaning stones, New Stone Age, right, or Neolithic period. This began around 10,000 BC, depending on where you were in the world, and goes to the end of prehistory, what we discussed in the previous podcast, meaning everything before writing. So from about 10,000 BC to everything about before writing, we refer to as the Neolithic period. These two periods are known as the Stone Ages because at this time the only weapons and tools that humans were able to use and produce on a large scale were stone weapons and tools. Eventually we developed metal weapons and tools, which are much better, but at this time period humans are using only stone weapons and tools to achieve their tasks. All right, our next objective is to describe what nomads are, so define nomads and describe their way of life. So nomads, okay, modern humans lived toward the end of the Old Stone Age. These humans were called nomads, or people who move from place to place to find food. Right, that's the big part of that. They moved from place to place so that they could find food. You had to eat every day. Right? The way nomads got their food was from hunting and gathering. Hunting, you have to go in search of the animals. They don't just stand out there in the forest waiting for you to come and kill them. So nomads often had to move with the herds, and they had to move to gather more berries or more fruits or more shellfish and different things like that, things that they would gather. They moved from place to place. Since they hunted and gathered for food, people lived together in small groups. You could not have a group of more than 30 people. Once you did, you realized pretty quickly that you did not have enough food, or you could not gather or hunt enough food to feed all of those people. So groups would either break up or people would starve, right? And the group would go back down to having 20 or 30 people. In this type of society, a nomadic society, men were usually the ones who hunted and fished. Right? They're the ones responsible for going out into the forest or going out in the plains and hunting animals or fishing to bring back meat or bring back fish for food. Women and children were in charge of gathering food. So they gathered things like berries, fruits, nuts, grains, and shellfish. Bring these things back just like the men bring back meat so that people can eat it and survive. So depending on where you were in the world, or wherever you were in the world, you had to develop strategies for survival, and they would be much different from place to place in the world. So for example, with food, right, you had to develop ways of finding food for yourself. Right? So humans use food available to them in their home environment. You have to use what's available to you. If you live On the plains of Africa, you might be hunting elephants for your meat. However, if you live in the Arctic, you might be hunting things entirely different, like seals. You hunt what's available to you. You find food that's available to you in the place that you're living in. Same thing goes with shelter, right? You use the materials found in your environment. If you live in a place with a lot of forests or a lot of wood available, you would build your shelters out of wood. If you do not have that available, use what's there. If you're in the Arctic, you might use snow, right, to make an igloo. That's the only thing that's really available to you there to make your shelter for you to survive. Eventually, humans learned how to control fire. So at some point, early humans learned to control fire. I'll let you look at this cartoon. It's a funny way of describing how the origin of fire can be traced to. We then go to spoken language. Eventually, every society in the world learns how to use spoken language. What this allows us to do is to communicate during hunting, which makes us more proficient at hunting, being better hunters, right? We can communicate and come up with a plan, but also to make plans for the future, right? We can communicate that by talking to one another. Right, another little cartoon to explain this, to explain the development of spoken language. All right, and then eventually we know, anthropologists and archaeologists know, that humans developed the ability to travel across water. Right? This does not mean that Stone Age humans were traveling across the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean or anything like that. But we were able to travel across short distances. Right? So some early humans learned to travel across water, and this allowed humans to move to different parts of the world. So places like Australia, or the islands in the Pacific, or Japan, or Madagascar, or all these places that the only way you can get there is by traveling across water. The way humans got there was by eventually learning how to be able to do that, right? Building boats, building things that could float and allow them to get across that water. All right, early religious beliefs. We know that early humans had religious beliefs. Right? So toward the end of the Old Stone Age, people began to leave clues that they had spiritual beliefs. Right? Remember, the only way that we know about the possibility of these religious beliefs are by the clues that they left behind. Right? Humans were not writing at this point. So one of the clues that they left behind is by burying their dead with great care. All right? So when we look at these two burials, right? When these human beings were first buried, they were buried with everything that they would need to survive in the next life. They're buried with their clothing, they're buried with food and water and weapons and tools and jewelry and anything that they think they might need in the next life, they were buried with. Right? This shows that these humans believed in an afterlife. When you died, there was something else that happened. And these are the first types of spiritual or religious beliefs, burying their dead with great care. We also have the examples of cave paintings. Right? Cave paintings show a belief that spirits are in everything. Cave paintings a lot of times were of animals, especially the animals that were hunted by humans. Right? It shows that they believed there were spirits in these animals. This leads to the first type of religion that we're going to talk about this year, and this religion is called animism. Animism is the belief that spirits and forces reside in animals, plants, objects, or dreams. It is the first known religion. Think of Native Americans, right? The types of beliefs that a lot of Native Americans have. The idea that there are spirits in the water, in the rivers, the mountains, in the animals, in the plants. Right? This is animism. These were the first types of religions that were developed around the world. Religions eventually become more complex, with gods and different things like that. But at first, most people believed in something similar to this, right? That spirits and forces reside in animals, plants, or objects. All right, so now to look at the Neolithic Revolution itself. So we said Neolithic means the new Stone Age, so what happened in the new Stone Age that made it different from the old Stone Age? So that thing that happened is that the new Stone Age begins with farming. It's when humans first learned how to farm. So it begins around 10,000 BC, and this is when humans made a huge breakthrough. They learned how to farm. This was probably done by accident. They saw that when seeds dropped on the ground and were left there, they eventually grew and became plants, which they could harvest for food. And they started doing this on purpose, and that's what farming is. This changes the way the world worked. Right? So the Neolithic Revolution definition, when humans learned to farm to produce food. Around the same time, people also started to domesticate animals, right? So the domestication of plants is farming. The domestication of animals is something a little bit different. They start using animals on farms. Farmers learn to domesticate plants and animals. The definition of domesticate is to raise in a controlled way that makes them best suited for human use. So plants, planting seeds, having them grow into more plants, harvesting them and then planting their seeds to grow more plants is a controlled way that makes them best suited for human use. Domesticating animals can be done the same way, right? You tame these animals, you domesticate them so that they're easier to use for human use. So some benefits of domesticating animals. First benefit is just meat, right? You can slaughter the animals. It's much easier to go out into your fenced-in area outside your farm to go get a pig and slaughter it and have meat that way, rather than go out for 5 hours and try and hunt a buffalo. So you have food. You can also use the skins for clothing or shelter or blankets. You can use the eggs if you have some type of poultry that you have domesticated, chickens or ducks, different animals like that. Milk, right? If they're an animal that produces milk that can be consumed by humans, you would use that, right? So think of cattle or goats, cattle and goats being the two biggest, right, that you would use milk for. So a little look at domestication around the world. So what type of animals were domesticated in different parts of the world. The first known domesticated animal is man's best friend, the dog, and they were first domesticated in China. If you go into Western Asia, a lot of goats and sheep and pigs were domesticated and used for human use. Turkey and Western Africa, you see a lot of cattle, cows being used, right, being domesticated. And if you go to South America, the people that lived there had to domesticate llamas and alpacas because those were the type of animals that lived there. So how does this change life for humans, right? That's the big thing that you need to know about the Neolithic Revolution. So here we're going to describe the effects of the Neolithic Revolution on humans throughout the world. So first of all, what major lifestyle changes did farming allow people to make? So first of all, farming allowed people to produce more food. If you had more food, you could have a larger population. You could have more people. Right? When you are simply a society of hunters and gatherers, we said you could only support 20 to 30 people before you ran out of food for everyone. So when you hunt and you gather, you have a small population. Farming allows you to have a much larger population. Depending on how good you are at farming, you may be able to produce much more food, more people. You could eventually support millions of people, depending on how efficient you were at farming as a society. Right? We've all seen this sticker before on pickup trucks and cars driving around. No farms, no food. Right? We got to have farms to have food today. People could then stay in one place. They were actually forced to stay in one place. Farmers cannot simply go on vacation for 3 weeks. Right? If you know anybody that's a farmer or your family farms themselves, they don't get to go on a long vacation. If you leave for 2 weeks, your crops, your animals die or don't grow very well. So people had to stay in one place. This allows the first villages to develop. Villages eventually become towns, maybe with a few hundred people or a few thousand people. These towns eventually become cities with hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of people. It allows you to have a better quality of life. This is from a commercial from the old Geico cavemen. All right, the Neolithic Revolution, the ability to settle down allowed people to have a better quality of life. Right? Two of the earliest villages that were established were the villages of Jericho and Catalhoyuk. I'm going to skip through a lot of information specifically about them, but these were Neolithic villages. These were villages that were created when groups of people learned how to farm and were able to efficiently farm enough to support thousands of people living in a village. I'm just going to skip through. Don't need to know all of this. All right, so we get to some other things that the Neolithic Revolution allowed people to do. So their ways of life changed, right? Settling down and living in a village is much different from camping in a different place every couple days or every couple weeks. So first of all, what this allowed these societies to do was allowed men to dominate. In hunting and gathering, men and women were pretty much equal. They both went out every day and searched for food. Men went and hunted and fished. Women went and hunted or gathered food. But they both brought back something for people to eat. So in hunting and gathering societies, men and women were actually pretty equal. In farming societies and Neolithic societies, men start to begin to dominate. They'd start dominating family life. They start dominating economic and political life. They become the leaders. They become the people who tell other people what to do, women and children specifically. Older men formed councils and made decisions for the society. When you had larger groups of people, you could not simply vote on everything or every decision that was made. You had to have a group of people who would help make those decisions for the society as a whole. So these tended to be, in most Neolithic societies, the older men of the society. They were the wiser ones. They were the ones who had been there for longer. They were men. They helped make the decisions. So look at this cartoon.
Lunch is on your own tomorrow. That's lunch is on your own tomorrow.
So we also start to see in times of little food, so if there's a drought or if the crops aren't growing like they should be, or there's just not enough to go around, we start seeing people fight for food. All right, so instead of going out and hunting for food, they're going out and taking food from other people. So when we see little food, we see warfare for really the first time, where humans are fighting other humans to survive. If you don't have food, you got to take it from somebody else. So little food equals warfare. This allowed warriors to become powerful. Warriors were always the men, so men became much more powerful and more important in society. We also have the idea of personal property. This is the first time this idea came about. When people were hunters and gatherers, they shared everything. Any food that they found or hunted and brought back to camp was shared with everyone. Just because you killed the deer doesn't mean your family gets to eat it before anybody else's. Everybody in hunting and gathering societies shared everything. When people start settling down, people started owning and having personal property. And when you see societies that have personal property, you start seeing differences in personal property, differences in wealth. Some people have more stuff than others. Might have more shovels or better shovels and tools or better weapons or more food or a bigger house and things like that. You start to see differences in wealth, and this causes conflict a lot of times. You get jealous of people who have more stuff than you, and it causes arguments and causes conflict among people. So you look at this cartoon. And then lastly, what we're going to look at today is the idea that people had to try and develop new technologies. You had to become better at producing food. The better you became at producing food, the more likely your society was going to survive, the more likely that your society would thrive and grow. Right? So to farm successfully, people had to develop new technologies. They had to think about ways of protecting their crops. Building fences, for example, that's a way of protecting your crops from animals or from other people. You had to be able to measure out seed so that you didn't plant everything more than you needed and it didn't all grow very well. Right? You had to be able to measure it out so that you could plant it at the right time. You also had to be able to measure time accurately. You had to develop something like a calendar to keep track of what season it was, whether it was going to be warm or cold out, or whether it was going to rain a lot or it wasn't going to rain a lot. That allowed you to become much more efficient at farming. And you also had to be able to store the food, right? Store it in a place where animals aren't going to get to it, where it's not going to rot, so that you can use it months down the line. And you also had to be able to plow fields more efficiently. The quicker you were able to plow fields, the better you'd be able, more plants you'd be able to crop, the more you'd be able to produce, the more efficient you would be at farming. Right? And you also have to remember that knowledge travels slowly. So even though different groups of people came up with new technologies, this did not always travel throughout the world very quickly. Right? You might develop a new way of doing something, you tell your friend tells a few other people, and that was the only way things traveled, the only way knowledge traveled back then. There were no books, there certainly was no internet, there were no YouTube videos that you could go onto and search for how to plow a field most efficiently. You had to learn it yourself or learn it from a friend or somebody you lived near. So technologies did not develop everywhere in the world at the same time. That's an important idea to understand, and we will talk more about that in class and within future vodcasts. All right, so that is it for today. Remember, should have taken the guided notes when you were watching this video. Bring them to class, and we'll be looking at this more in depth in class. All right, see you guys in class.